Hello, this is Tael, and welcome to Tael Talks. And today I'd like to talk about a little game called Gears of War for the Xbox 360. Gears of War, of course, came out in 2006. I believe it was the first game to come out using the Unreal 3 engine. It was really the game that showed what that next generation, which is ironically the last generation, but it really showed what that generation of hardware was capable of, and it really showed what the Unreal 3 engine, which became the go-to engine for pretty much everything of the last generation, was really capable of. And I was ridiculously excited for Gears. That initial trailer that they released was just beautiful, got me incredibly pumped, and it was really, for me personally, the game that ushered in that generation of games. So recently, of course, I went back and played through it again. In fact, I've been playing through the whole series. I've played through the original trilogy now, and I only have Judgment left. But I thought I'd do this video now. But, so 8 years have passed since Gears of War came out, and I thought, well, how is it going to be going back to it now? Will it have aged well? A lot of games from this time on the system have not aged well. Could this possibly have happened to Gears? Well, no. Gears still feels like Gears. It feels fantastic, and it's still a great game. So let me give you a little explanation as to why. So largely I think the reason that Gears still works is purely because of the combat. It feels just as fresh now as it did when it came out, and that's kind of strange because there was a lot of people, or a lot of games, trying to imitate Gears after its release. So the fact that it still feels fresh 8 years later is very, very surprising. So I asked myself, why does it still feel fresh? And I think a large part of it is actually because of the simple things, the small things. It's things like the action reload system, which was a very new idea at the time. So in Gears, when you need to reload, you can either press the whatever button it is, I can't remember off the top of my head, to reload your weapon and just watch the animation go through. But if you look in the top right corner, there's actually a little gauge, and if you tap the button again at just the right moment, you'll actually reload your weapon mid-animation. It will speed through. And this gives it a nice little risk-reward system, because essentially if you fuck that up and you tap it at the wrong time, you'll actually jam your weapon, which is going to leave you vulnerable, and you don't want that. So it's such a simple thing to add to a game like this, and it works fantastically. And if you were to take the action reload system away from Gears, I don't think it would feel like Gears anymore, to be perfectly honest. Something else it introduced was, of course, cover-based shooting. So when Cliff Bleszinski started working this game, his main inspiration, he has openly said, was Resident Evil 4. And Resident Evil 4 is one of my all-time favorite games for reasons I'll get into when I do a video on it. But something that Resident Evil 4 did not have was a cover system. In fact, it was very, very slow and cumbersome, and that worked to build tension in that game. But Gears of War, of course, is a action-packed war shooter, so they couldn't have that. So Gears is all about running quickly into cover and just popping up, taking off a few pot shots, and of course going back under the cover again before you get hit in the face with a bullet. So this cover mechanic, I believe there was another game on the PS2, someone will probably leave it in the comments, that had a cover system before this, but Gears is what really popularized the cover system. I remember when there was a cover system put into Grand Theft Auto 4, it was like, wow, the GTA guys are copying off this game. That's how influential this was when it initially came out. It was pretty amazing the difference it made. So you have an action reload system, you have popping in and out of cover, which was very, very much a novelty at the time, and exciting, and allowed for a great deal of strategy, which a lot of shooters at the time didn't really have a lot of. So that added a lot to it. And there was also the AI. The enemies were all quite intelligent. They'll flank you around cover, they'll throw grenades behind cover. They could be complete bastards at times. Sometimes they were a little bit cheap, but generally they were mean but fair. And I remember dying in the same places over and over again, and every time I'd try again, they would act completely differently. And that was something that really impressed me back then. It still kind of impressed me now. In fact, I would say that the original Gears is definitely the hardest Gears in terms of flat-out difficulty in that regard. Another thing that really helps the game is the weapons. Gears has some fantastic weapons in it. Of course, you got all your staples. You got your shotguns, your sniper rifles, etc., etc. But the two weapons that always stick in my mind for Gears are the frag grenades. Now, grenades are nothing new in games, obviously. They're used in heaps of things. But there's something about the frag grenades in Gears. Maybe it's the way they look, or the ticking sound they make as they bounce along the ground, or that dull thud explosion. But that sounds just like it's magic to me, and it always takes me back. And the other weapon is, of course, the one that was most hyped, which was the Lancer. which is essentially an assault rifle with a chainsaw attached to the bottom of it. And running up to an enemy and cutting them in half with a chainsaw is just oh so very satisfying, and it never, ever, ever got old. Ever. And it was that gritty hardness to that violence, the combat that made Gears feel so alive and so rich and so good. On top of this, the combat arenas were all incredibly well designed. So the game's basically a series of little linear corridors, which occasionally will have enemies popping in and out of them. But generally this is a linear corridor, and that'll be followed up by an open area or a large enclosed area where combat will take place. And of course these are designed so, because of the cover system, that you can flank around the left or the right to get behind them, or you can approach it however you want. And it's the tacticalness, is that a word? Of these environments that really makes them feel so well crafted. And I know a lot of time went into crafting these little combat arenas. I think my personal favorite is actually, there's a giant stairwell outside of a place called Phoenix Manor, and you start at the bottom of the stairs and you have to work your way up. And of course everyone who's ever played a shooter knows that those on the high ground always have an advantage, and it's no different here, and it makes that climb to the top that much more satisfying, because the further you get, the harder the enemies get. And it might only take you 3 or 4 minutes to get up there, probably less if you're really good at the game. You could probably get there in 30 seconds. But it's a genuinely satisfying scenario, and it just feels great to get up there and be like, I made it to the top of these stairs. It's such a simple thing. Getting to the top of stairs generally in real life is not an accomplishment, but here, thanks to the way it's designed, it feels like an accomplishment. And I think that's one of those things that makes Gears very special. Another small touch that I don't think a lot of gamers pick up on, I mean, your brain did, but you don't consciously recognize it, is the roadie run. So this is the way the camera sweeps down and bobs around behind the player's character, Marcus Phoenix, generally, if you're playing through single player like I do. It bobs around, and I remember Cliff Bleszinski saying that was to try to emulate the look of war documentaries when the journalists would run behind the soldiers. This little camera move here is an incredibly small and simple thing, but it adds so much weight and momentum to the sense of movement of Marcus Phoenix, and to, if you're playing multiplayer, the same sort of thing. It gives you such a sense of weight and momentum that the game just wouldn't work without. And it's all of these elements that come together that makes Gears, I think, still the best third-person cover-based shooter ever released. And of course, I'll get into the sequels later on and why I think they're superior and inferior at the same time, but Gears is purely a cover-based third-person shooter, and I think it's still the one to beat in that regard. And it's all these things coming together that makes Gears feel so special. I think there's also some boss fights worth mentioning. Now, there's some disappointing ones in here. An example would be there's a giant spider thing. I've forgotten what they're called. It's just left in my mind. I feel bad. That fight is underwhelming. It happens in a really cool location, but it's rather underwhelming. But one that does always stand out and is very awesome, there's actually 2 of these, or 3 of these actually, is a fight with a berserker. So these are incredibly well designed. So the first time you meet the berserker, you're in an enclosed environment and you find out that your weapons cannot hurt it, and instead you're just trying to make noise to lure it to knock down some doors so you can get outside. Through this whole sequence, because it's the first time that you've actually felt helpless. I mean, you still have your weapons, but they don't have any effect on it, so you feel helpless and like you can't do anything. The beauty of it is, once you get outside, you get access to a weapon called the Hammer of Dawn. This is a gun that summons a giant beam from a satellite up above you. So you're out in the open, you lure this creature out in the open, and all of a sudden, you're absolutely frying this fucking thing. And that reversal is incredibly satisfying. It is incredibly well paced, beautifully crafted. And it's that sense of empowerment that makes that boss fight exciting, after being, for a few minutes, stripped of that. Then you fight a second one later on, and you think it's going to be a similar scenario, but it turns out that you actually have to fight it with the Hammer of Dawn in an enclosed environment. So it's taking the first two, the 2 elements from the first one and mashing them together. So the Hammer of Dawn only works in specific places after you force it to knock down other areas of the ceiling or whatever. And that leads to its own sense of tension. So you're basically doing 2 things from the original at the same time, and trying to survive it is like pokey little area, and that adds a whole other level of tension. And I think these 2 boss fights are Gears at their best in terms of boss fights. I'll get to, when I get to Gears 3, I'll talk about another boss fight which I really appreciated. But generally, I think they're probably the 2 best boss fights in the series in terms of smaller boss fights like that. Expertly handled. The game also still looks great. So this game's 8 years old, and it was the poster child for the Unreal 3 engine, and it still looks beautiful. Of course, the color palette is a bit dull. It's all browns and greys, which was the style at the time. But I think Gears actually uses them in a very appropriate and clever way. So the world's been ravaged by war. It's very rough, it's very dusty, it's very much in ruins. And the grey and brown obviously lends itself well to that. But when you play the first, probably, I'd say, third of the game, that's what the whole game looks like. Then all of a sudden it's nighttime, and everything's kind of like got this blue glow to it, and that actually makes the game feel unsettling because you get so used to seeing browns and greys that when you see an actual color like a blue, it feels alien and unusual, and it actually heightens the tension, I think, in that regard. So that's another really clever element. And also during the nighttime you get to meet Krill, which still look, the scene where they fly up out of the city still looks fantastic. The Krill are a very good idea in terms of enemies. It's a shame that they didn't make a return in the sequels. That always kind of upset me. There's also another area later on in the game where you go into an area that's full of emulsion, and it's bright yellow, which once again is very different to what you've been seeing up until that point in the game, and it's very refreshing. So while it does use a lot of browns and greys, it uses other colors very sparingly to give you certain emotions, to make you feel wonder or tense or things like that. So the game very cleverly uses color, and I don't think a lot of people appreciate just how well done these little aspects of the game actually are. The engine itself, obviously this was a very early game, so there's a lot of texture pop in, which is something that Unreal games are still dealing with, and some other technical issues, but really the game as a whole still looks incredibly good. And I was quite impressed with just how well the character models and the animations really held up. Within minutes, I'd totally forgotten I was playing an 8-year-old game. Likewise, the sound design is fantastic. All of the weapons sound incredibly beefy and powerful and strong. The sound of a head cracking when it's hit with a sniper rifle bullet is beautiful, incredibly gratifying. You can hear the locusts saying things off in the distance before they come into the field of view, giving you little audio cues. I think the best one's probably the boomers, who are these big guys who carry rocket launchers. Before they shoot off a rocket, they go boom, which lets you know that it's probably time to change the location of cover because you're going to get hit with a rocket in a second. And it's these little things which your brain kind of picks up on when you're playing to know when to move around. Audio cues, they're all very well placed, and they all sound great, and they're very well used. And likewise, the score, it has a fantastic score. The Gears theme is absolutely brilliant. And it's a very dynamic score that goes up and down with the actual what's happening on screen with the gameplay. It's absolutely fantastic. I would recommend giving it a download if you haven't actually sat down and listened to it, because it's beautifully orchestrated. No cheesy Martin O'Donnell guitar, which always kind of bothered me. It's a very classical symphonic orchestration, and I definitely recommend it highly. Last, of course, there's the characters in terms of positive things. Marcus, the lead character, he's pretty blank. At this point in the series, he doesn't have a lot to him, but he says some funny lines. John DiMaggio does him well, does some funny stuff. There's, of course, his best friend, Dom. Dom is a fantastic character, and he really grows throughout the series, and I think he's probably the most dynamic and versatile and interesting character throughout the whole game series. Baird starts out as a bit of a whiny bitch. He kind of stays that way, but he's not an annoying kind of whiny bitch. He's kind of funny, mainly because of the way he gets played off by Dom. And of course, Cole, the Cole Train, who everyone loves. What can I say about Cole Train other than he's that guy? If you saw him at a pub, you'd want to hang out with him. In fact, any of these guys, except maybe Marcus, he's maybe a little bit too flat. But any of these other guys, you could easily sit down and have a drink with at a bar and have a good chat to him, I think. And I think that's a very important thing. I mean, they're all dumb and silly and very shallow characters, but they feel real in the context of the universe that they're in, and that's what's important. Of course, the game does have some flaws to it. Nothing major, mind you, but they are there. The most obvious thing is the story. I've finished this game probably 5 or 6 times now, and I still don't exactly know what it's about or what's happening most of the time. I think the most standout example to me is there's a moment where the characters set off what is called a light mass bomb. They go down into an emulsion mine and they set this thing off, and it's supposed to map all the tunnels or like fry everything or something, and it doesn't quite work. And they get to the top and Baird pulls out this little thing which has a bunch of maps on it, and he's like, we could use this to find something about something else. And it's like, where did that come from? Was that on the grass when you guys come out of the mines? Did you have it the whole time? Where is that? And what is that? And where did it come from? I don't know. And that's always bothered me. Probably more than any other of the plot holes or weird things in this game. There's a lot of things like that that just seem to happen for convenience sake. Thankfully, this is something that doesn't happen so much in the later games. It is definitely an issue for this one, and really don't know what it's about or what's going on most of the time. There are also some occasional difficulty spikes. I always, for some reason, when I get into the emulsion mines, there's these guys who have these weapons called tech bows. Are they tech bows? They're like tech bows in Turok. They're basically arrows that explode. For some reason, when I get up to here, maybe it's the design of the layout of the arena, I'm not entirely sure, but I always get my ass handed to me after breezing through everything else before here. And I don't know why that is. It's just something about these enemies that, I don't know if they're too good at shots or what, or if I don't play carefully enough, but I always die a lot here. And likewise, once you're inside the Phoenix Manor, there's a sequence where you have to defend it from waves of these enemies coming in. And I also find that to be a really difficult part of the game. And it's weird that it's actually the second last stage of the game, but it's more difficult than the final stage. So it actually feels more like a climax than the climax of the game does, which is very, very strange to me. And I don't know if that was a deliberate thing, or if it was originally going to be the end of the game and they added on the extra chapters at the end. So I'll be very interested to know if why that is. There's also the issue of Ram. Ram is the villain of the game, and he's basically just a big, angry locust. All the locusts look ugly, and they're all big and chunky and whatever, but Ram's bigger and chunkier than meaner than any of them. And he's not very interesting, or he has, I don't know what his motives are, you never find any of that out. He's just kind of there, being himself. And I don't think he's a particularly great villain, and he doesn't do a whole lot for me, to be perfectly honest. So I always found him to be a bit of a weak link in the game. And his end boss fight's kind of really underwhelming compared to some of the boss fights earlier in the game. So that's also a thing. And lastly, this is a very minor complaint, but it's something that bugs the absolute hell out of me. So the last level takes place on a train, and you're just shooting locusts and whatever to get to Ram on the other end. There's an enemy on this train that doesn't belong there. So earlier in the game you meet these creatures called lambent wrenches. Now wrenches are just like these little guys that climb on walls and shit. And basically lambent means that they're infected with emulsion, which is of course that mineral from the planet's core, that makes them explosive. That in itself isn't a bad thing, and playing through this game when it came out it just didn't bother me. But the fact they're on the train doesn't make sense, because in the later games you find out that the locusts are actually at war with the lambent because the lambent are trying to wipe them out. So the fact that the lambent wretches are on the train with the locusts helping them out doesn't make sense. Wretches on the train in general doesn't make sense, but them helping the locusts on the train makes even less sense. And I don't know if it's because the war between the lambent and the locusts hadn't been set in stone at this point when they were developing it, or they just didn't care, or if it was just they feel like they're just put there to make it a little bit more challenging, but they don't make sense in the context of the story or the universe, and that bugs the absolute shit out of me. I don't know if anyone's even picked up on this. Maybe it's just me that this bothers, but it definitely bothers me. Overall though, Gears, what can I say? Gears of War is a fantastic game. The original Gears of War is incredibly focused. It's third-person cover-based shooting all day, every day, except for one vehicle section. It's definitely the most focused of the three. Is it of the four? Oh, I should say. I haven't played the fourth one yet. Maybe it isn't as focused as the fourth. I guess I'll find out. Definitely the original trilogy, though. Is it the best of the original trilogy? You could debate that. I kind of enjoy the spectacle of the second one, and it feels a lot tighter with what's there, but the first one's definitely a much more streamlined experience in terms of what it is and what it sets out to do. Either way, I can recommend all three of the games, and I'm sure I'll be able to recommend the fourth one as well once I've played it. Very easily. I've picked up the original Gears and Gears 2 for like $2 each. Gears of War 3 is like $3, and Judgment's like $6 secondhand now. So there's absolutely no reason for you to not own these games if you have an Xbox 360. If you haven't got them yet, go out there and do yourself a favor and grab them right now. So, what are your thoughts on Gears? Which one's your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe. This has been Tael Talks. I hope you've enjoyed watching and listening, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one!